Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have Dr. Stephen Ostoja. He's the director of the USDA California Climate Hub at the Agricultural Research Service and the John Muir Institute for the Environment. I'm going to talk about climate change and its effect on species. So, Stephen, thank you for coming.
Oh, you're welcome. Nice to be with you, Rich.
So tell me about your work at USDA. What do you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the director of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Climate Hub. So the Climate Hub program was established about 6 years ago in the previous Secretary Vilsack administration. We're effectively the department's applied climate science program. And what that means is we basically help resource managers, foresters, farmers, ranchers not only cope with the effects of climate change, extreme events, but also prepare for future events. So increased resilience, make them a little more able to kind of withstand the pushing on the wall or the stressors associated with climate change and what we expect that to bring. But there's also a renewed interest in mitigation. That is both, sequestration, pulling greenhouse gases into natural systems, and also offsetting or avoiding emissions. So we work on both sides of that coin with our stakeholder base.
Well, what's happening with farmers and ranchers and things? What are they observing?
Well, I mean, it depends where you are, right? And so the Climate Hub that I run is specifically California. California's got, just shy of 40 million residents. We grow over 400 different commodities. We've got really diverse forest and rangeland systems. So depending on where you are and what you're talking about, different things are showing up in different places. I think one of the biggest thing right now, obviously, is we've been in a very significant drought for the last 2 years. In fact, we've been in drought conditions, by and large for the last 15, 17 or so years. Most people don't realize, but, most of California's water either comes as snowpack, which we're losing because the snow is moving higher up in elevation, or it comes from surface water runoff that's kind of moved into essentially, really mass on a global scale. It's unmatched into conveyance systems and reservoir systems. And when you lose either, the snow and you have less surface water, you just don't have available water for all sorts of different applications. I think that's one of the biggest issues is just drought, certainly. And right now we've got the development of La Nina, which, it's, of course, we can't predict the future with certainty, but generally speaking, when we have La Ninas building up, it generally suggests that we've got...
Did you say La Nina? So what's an El Nino and what's La Nina? What's the difference?
Yeah, right. So the difference is when those set up in the atmosphere, it oftentimes means for us in this part of the world, in the Northern California portion of the world, that we're going to see drought conditions in the coming winter months. So we'll see average to below average precipitation. And that kind of obviously be hugely significant, right? Because we won't have the snowpack. If that does hold true, we won't have the snowpack we need for restoring and building back some of the lost storage in our reservoir systems, and also soil moisture and, of course, groundwater recharge. I think that's one of the biggest issues. Of course, as you know, wildfires are a big deal out here, and they're not just in our forests and wildlands anymore. They're burning through communities. They're in what we call the wildland urban interface, or the WUI. The direct effects of fire, I think, kind of go without saying, but kind of indirectly, this has really compromised air quality. So it's got an enormous public health impact. We didn't see it so far this year too bad, but we saw it really bad last year and some years past, where we had essentially, wildland fire smoke hanging around in agricultural fields. So it really put the wine grape growing industry there at risk, because they had the smoke taint on the fruits around the berries. So that's, a huge economic factor. And I think the last thing I'll say is extreme heat, right? So we're seeing more and more just heat waves. That is where you have, kind of some high temperature threshold above, depending on where you are in the state, some level over 100 degrees for a sustained period of time, right? And it just doesn't cool down. And as you can imagine, just as if you were standing outside in the direct sunlight when it's 103 for 3 days straight, it's going to be pretty darn impactful. And we see that impact to a lot of the crop systems across California with that extreme heat.
So to start with water and drought, what are the, so you said snowpack melt is a source of water. Are there other sources being developed? And if so, what would they be?
Yeah, well, so California has a long-standing history of groundwater pumping. We pumped a lot of groundwater. I don't have the figure right in front of me, but we pumped a lot of groundwater during the 2012-2016 drought. That was the worst drought based on oak tree ring records in 1,200 years. So we do have kind of that backup savings account in groundwater, but we've been depleting groundwater resources at such a fast tick over the years that the recharge just hasn't kept up, or hasn't been able to restore that, right? So we do have new regulation in place called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which will be kind of a phased-in regulation on a local scale of groundwater use. But, I think we don't really have much investment right now in new surface water infrastructure, right? So the dams and the conveyance systems that we have in place now, that have been in place for decades, are basically what we have. So it does put us a little bit in a tricky spot looking forward in terms of water.
Well, yeah, groundwater I would think would run out. What about desalination? Is that still incredibly expensive, or how difficult is that?
Yeah, I don't know that much about it, to be honest with you, Rich. There are desalination operations. I think the cost of it, the energy demand of it, as well as some of the environmental concerns offshore, have been kind of fraught with some challenges in the legal system. But yeah, I don't know too much about that, and I don't know and I couldn't speak to the scale at which we would have to apply desal statewide or even Western-wide to kind of offset some of the predicted changes in surface water availability in the coming years.
So what are some of the proposed solutions for water specifically? And then, we can move on to fire and everything.
Yeah, one is to getting a better understanding of how to keep water in the system longer, right? So what does a forest structure need to look like in terms of the distribution and arrangement of trees, so that it captures snow and it keeps more snow on the landscape for longer periods of time, and then to have a better prediction around runoff, so that we know what we need to let out of reservoirs at the right time to accommodate the incoming, right? So it's essentially a refinement of all of the pinch points along that continuum from upper headwaters in our mountain systems all the way to our floodplains or our agricultural fields. There's a lot of great work in California working on water use efficiencies through micro sprinklers, through fertigation, through subsurface irrigation, as well as through identification of different crops and varieties that are more efficient for water use too. So I think there's a lot of opportunities that through technology and better modeling, it's going to kind of put a finer point on essentially the ins and the outs or the use of water in the years to come.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
How would you change a piece of land where there's crops growing to make sure water stayed there longer? Do you put up barriers, or do you plant other plants that act like plant-like camels that suck up water and keep it as a reservoir? Best practices?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. There are some practices. In particular, there's one called cover cropping, or I guess there's a couple I can mention. One is cover cropping, and that's and folks that are familiar with kind of driving through agricultural fields or plantations might see this. But if you can just imagine an orchard of trees, and they're evenly spaced in rows, and oftentimes between those rows you don't see anything on the floor, on the orchard floor. But what we're seeing more and more is the adoption of cover cropping, and that's the intentional planting of different grasses and forbs that cover that bare surface. And by doing that, they're increasing the soil organic carbon, and that allows for a greater amount of soil water staying in the system for longer periods of time, right? So there are some challenges with cover cropping, of course, right? But it does hold a lot of promise, I think, in becoming more drought resilient for agricultural operations. There is an additional practice that is being explored pretty broadly in California, and that's the application of composting. So putting clean, high-grade quality compost over wildlands, in particular rangelands, which are generally dominated by grasses, annual grasses, and some forbs mixed in. And the idea there is to essentially distribute that compost over the land surface, and it facilitates, an increase in soil organic carbon, and has been demonstrated in some cases to really increase the amount of water holding capacity over these systems, which, just like I mentioned in the agricultural systems with cover crops, adds the same value. So it adds a greater drought resilience, if you will.
You said that California produces like 400 different, items, almonds and all kinds of stuff. Is anyone out there looking at the 400 different crops, the economic impact of each, and then saying, all right, we have a Pareto, like an 80-20, these crops have the most problems, or if we lost these and we switched more to producing this, it would reduce water use, or, is there anyone looking at the 400 things produced as like a portfolio of California's revenue and kind of managing it in that sense, like weighing the environmental concerns versus the monetary concerns?
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Yeah, I mean that is being done, but as you can imagine, there's so much more to that, right? Because there are different crop varieties, there are different on-farm operational practices, and all of those different decisions, operational decisions, really change that equation in the end. It has been done in case by case basis. I'm not aware of a statewide study that has kind of essentially kept all things equal and said, oh, if you had more almonds of this variety or more wine grapes of that variety, or, less peaches here and more cherries there kind of thing. I'm not aware of that. It is obviously it's a balance, right? Because you're really talking about the water, energy, food security, economic nexus. And there is a tension at that, but it's difficult in a place like California where you have such a high degree of variability. You have so many different microclimates and soil types, and all of these things, interact in ways that kind of make it all really context or location or situation specific. And it becomes more difficult to generalize across a place so big and diverse like California.
Right, but farmers are growing all these things. Yet anyway, they've found their niche, they found what's working, and they're doing it for profit. But do you think it'll be useful to do a study like that, to look at everything and see the top producers and, their water use and maybe switch things around? And would that help conservation?
Well, I do, but I think at the end of the day, too, we have to remember that these farmers have different levels of water rights, so they have access to differing access to the resource that may not be the same as their neighbor or two neighbors down. But I do think looking at the whole system approach, as I mentioned earlier, looking at the headwaters and the surface water and the inflow to our reservoirs, and making more efficient the outflow of those reservoirs and the conveyance of those waters to kind of maximize their efficiency for agricultural application, it is definitely something that my agency, and I am not one of those scientists doing that per se, but that we are looking at. I think at the same time, one of the things we can't overlook is the potential for groundwater recharge, right? Is essentially how do we get that water back into our below ground deep aquifers when we have these opportunities of what we term atmospheric rivers, right? Where we have these like multi-day or kind of a large part of some day deluges of heavy precipitation, where you kind of get mass localized flooding. We want to also be able to take advantage of that, right? So it's not just all lost to runoff, but we can help recharge that system when we do have drought conditions into the future. We will have restored some of that groundwater as a resource that we can rely on, just like a savings account when times are more challenging.
Well, how does groundwater get replenished? I don't think you would pump it back in there for any reason, but is it the rain that's percolating down through the soil that makes it to the aquifer that recharges it, or is it that if it rains, you just never put it in the ground, but you keep it in storage ponds, and it's as if it's just another resource of water in addition to the groundwater?
Right. Well, both, right? We want to maximize the efficiency of our above ground reservoirs, as I mentioned, right? But groundwater recharge, yes, you can pump the water back into the aquifers, but you can also identify locations where you have the right soil permeability, the ability that is for the water to penetrate down back into the aquifers as well. And there are different practices and technologies that are kind of looking at that efficiencies. Right. We're part of a project that was just recently funded by the National Institute of Food and Agriculture that hasn't even essentially started yet, but we will be investigating different technologies, even using remote sensing and different imagery to identify locations that hold promise for groundwater recharge at a kind of a mass scale. So like I said, we would be able to take advantage of those heavy rainfall events and funnel the water essentially to the right place at the right time, such that you can really maximize the potential to get that water back into the aquifer.
And then in regards to fire, why is there more? I had heard that clearing of the underbrush on various lands is very important, and maybe selective burning to prevent, large wildfires. But what's involved in fire management? What's important?
Yeah, well, again, I think that question is a tough one to answer because it really depends on where you are, right? I think most of the attention or a lot of the attention has been on our forested systems. As you know, the United States has had a long-term policy of fire suppression. We've been rethinking that the last several decades, since the 80s, actually. But with, a century plus of essentially the elimination or the mass reduction of fire use and fire application, we've seen our forests change, right? So we historically had a more patchily distributed kind of forest structure and composition where we had, fewer but larger trees that were not necessarily evenly spaced across the forested landscape. That's what we see today as a function of fire suppression. And that, when that's been kind of exaggerated, if you will, or the susceptibility to mass fires has been exaggerated by some of the effects of climate change. So you have a fuels accumulation situation as a function of past management decisions that, I don't think were ill-intended. We just didn't have all of the best available information that we have now. And now you've got, some climatic factors that are stressing trees and accumulating and contributing to the susceptibility of these fires. So what we need to do is use all of the available tools that we have in the toolbox. And those include the use of fire. Fire, we have to remember these forested systems evolved with low intensity, low moderate intensity fire for millennia, just like they evolved with drought. And when you take something out of a system like fire and expect it to just behave as it would, that's just not the case. So we definitely need to be putting fire back onto the landscape. The application of prescribed fire, safe and doable using prescribed managed fire to do some of that work. But I think there are also opportunities where we can increase the pace and scale of mechanical treatments, like you said, where we can reduce the surface fuels and reduce some of the canopy closure situations where we don't have such a dense canopy and reduce the ability for fire to spread really rapidly in severe weather conditions.
What areas are the most susceptible to fire? And if there was fire, I guess it would destroy homes, but are there certain fire spots that, again, it's a heavy concentration of homes, and other ones where it's like, let's say, a heavy concentration of fields with crops? Or do the fires not tend to endanger the growing of crops, just more people's homes?
Yeah, no, I mean, the fire and what I was terming the wildland-urban interface is a real concern in California. And we are looking at locations across California that appear to be more prone to negative fire effects or catastrophic fire effects. But we have to remember the majority of our fires in California are not started by the forests or the wildlands themselves, right? A lot of these fires are starting by infrastructure malfunction, whether that's power lines or other equipment use at the wrong time at the wrong place. And in some cases, intentional setting, right? We have, illegal campfires in some cases. We have arson in other cases. And I think that's part of the conversation that is often overlooked, is if we just have we often hear this term better forest management, but we kind of forget about the part of the conversation that says, hey, well, look, we've got more people living in our rural areas now than we ever had before. We have a higher likelihood of accidental ignitions through whether those are based on power infrastructure or based on equipment use, like I said, at a not the best time, or in some unfortunate cases, illegal activity of fire ignitions. I think that's some of what we need to look at too.
What other issues are important for California? So we have water, we have fire. What are some of the other top resources that it's very important to look at?
Well, I think, one of the things that we want to make sure that we're paying attention to and definitely getting more awareness to is the priorities of what we call our disadvantaged communities across California, right? We have, in some cases, some of the poorest air quality in the United States in our southern San Joaquin Valley. I think, with greater aridity and drying periods, that facilitates an increase in poor air quality and things like valley fever. I think, some of the kind of the socio-ecological impacts of climate change are really, really important for us in California. And I think there's a lot of room for advancing our work in those areas as well, so that we can serve, the interests of all Californians and make for a more equitable future.
Well, very good. For people interested, where can they go to learn more about what USDA is doing and all the various environmental efforts?
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'll share too that the U.S. Department of Agriculture just released an adaptation plan that you can find on the USDA webpage. And if you're interested to learn more about the USDA Climate Hubs, you can simply Google USDA Climate Hubs, and our webpage will pop right up. There are 10 climate hubs across the nation. California is unique. It's the only regional hub that is also a state, but you can find on the top of that webpage, wherever you happen to live in the country, you can find your local climate hub and locate the staff there and feel free to reach out. They'd be happy to assist you.
Okay, very good. Well, Steve, thank you for coming on the podcast, and it's been very interesting. I appreciate it.
You bet, Rich. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.